Our News on Terror segment tonight, a terrorist attack struck a French supermarket, leaving 3 people dead last week. The attack started when a 26-year-old Moroccan extremist fired shots at police officers, shouting Allahu Akbar and vengeance for Syria. Then he drove to a supermarket where he held shoppers and employees hostage and demanded Salah Abdeslam be released. Salah Abdeslam, as you remember, is one of the terrorists responsible for the Paris terror attacks. Now, this has all the markings of an international crisis, certainly a radical Islamic terror attack, but unfortunately, CNN had more important news to cover. With me now to break this down from the Center for Security Policy, Kyle Shideler. Kyle, thanks for joining me.
Liz, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Kyle, I don't quite understand why this story is not more in the news here. This was a terror attack. People were killed by a radical Islamist terrorist in a country that has suffered many, many attacks of such kinds. We had a very brief blip of coverage on the news and then nothing.
That's true, Liz. This has been a pattern now for some time, really since the Western countries declared victory over ISIS in Syria and Iraq. There's been no desire by the media to cover follow-up incidents of terror like this one. As you said, a number of people were killed by an individual that, once again, Western intelligence agencies were firmly aware of. He's a so-called known wolf, meaning that law enforcement agencies were aware of him and were tracking him, and yet he still was able to carry out his attack. As you say, he was a Moroccan, born in Morocco, but became a French citizen, and he was a petty criminal, so he was likely radicalized in prison. This is a classic case of all of the sorts of things that we're seeing in these terrorist incidents, but the media doesn't want to talk about it because our struggle with terrorism isn't over.
Right, and the scary part to me is that what's happening in France, and we see this in the UK as well, but specifically France because of this incident, what's happening in France, I believe, is what is going to happen here in our country if we continue along the trajectory that we are. And I mean that in two veins. First of all, France has extremely strict gun control laws. Their citizens have no means to defend themselves against radicals, against terrorists like this man, like we saw in the Paris attacks. France is also very politically correct about radical Islam. They don't want to identify that the motivation behind these attacks are perhaps warped versions of Islam, but that these are religious beliefs that are motivating these attacks. We see that happening in France. We see how often they are suffering these attacks. I mean, how many years until we see the same thing here in America with our gun control laws, the left calling for stricter gun control, and accusing anyone who condemns radical Islam of being Islamophobic?
Well, Liz, I think you make an important point there. The French law enforcement have said that they're unable to keep control of the weapons flowing into France, mostly from the Balkans. But they have AK-47, actual assault rifles, meaning fully automatic, rocket launchers, which of course are not legal anywhere, flowing into these areas of France that are uncontrolled because they don't control the communities there, and the communities there don't feel that they're a part of France, or that they are French in any meaningful way. And so you have a sort of alternative system of governance, a shadow governance which grows up, forcing the French state out. The French intelligence have been quite open about this, preparing plans a few years ago for the possible retaking of national territory if it should become necessary. And yet the media is not covering the degree to which the European countries, France in particular, have a very serious problem with this minority population and the ideology that has grown up within it.
Right, and I think it also shows that some of these European countries, I hope it's not happening here in the United States, although when you hear some liberal foreign policy or liberal anti-terrorism, it makes me wonder. But they don't quite acknowledge that the strategy of the Islamic State has morphed into this lone wolf type of attack, where these individuals are radicalized outside of the caliphate, outside of the sort of nucleus of the Islamic State, and that they feed off of each other, that one attack inspires the next attack, and making it even more important to stop these attacks. But when you don't acknowledge that that's the strategy, it's very, very difficult to fight it and to stop it. And we see that, like you said, authorities knew about this guy from an online terror forum. Plus, he was a convicted criminal, I believe, for drug charges, yet they didn't do anything to stop him. Kyle, we are out of time, but I appreciate you coming on the show. Thanks for being here.